Hello, my name is Sharon McGowan and I'll be moderating this microsession. We have a terrific panel of experts today who will be discussing the vital role of research and data collection in the struggle to create real, foundational, and systemic, not simply cosmetic, equity, diversity, and inclusion in our industry. Our panelists today are Dr. Amanda Coles, Department of Management from the Deakin Business School at Deakin University, Tamara DeWitt, Strategic Lead, Equity and Inclusion for the Canada Media Fund, Dr. Sarah Diamond, President Emerita, OCAD University, Joan Jenkinson, Executive Director, Black Screen Office, and Doreen Manuel, the Director of the BOSA Centre for Film and Animation. This panel is presented by the Women in Film and Television Canada Coalition, a new organization of autonomous women in film chapters from across Canada. On behalf of the WIFT Canada Coalition, I'd like to acknowledge that we each live and work on ancestral Indigenous land, and we respectfully acknowledge all Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we pay our respect to elders both past and present. I personally am speaking from Vancouver on the unceded Indigenous land belonging to the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. To start things off with this panel, I'd like to ask each of our experts to answer or comment on the following questions. Why is your organization, or you as a researcher or industry leader, focused on data collection or advocacy with data to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion? And how are you going about it? Is there an example of best practices that inspires you in your efforts? And I'd like to start with Dr. Amanda Coles, who just completed a new study on our industry commissioned by WIFT Canada Coalition with some very significant results. And her report also includes a strong recommendation for a national approach to data collection. Dr. Coles.
Hi, Sharon. Thanks. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate today. I'd like to start with sort of situating the report in its context, which of course interrogated the role that whether the risk management decisions taken by key industry players and decision makers under COVID-19 were interacting with current efforts underway to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in the Canadian film and TV industry. And the reason that that's such an interesting question is that COVID has really underscored how important data is and why sharing and communicating data is important. We now understand, as a consequence of COVID, how data tells us about our relationships with each other as we have a new relationship to those daily data outputs around COVID that shape our daily lives. So in a project-based industry, like the film and television industry, networks are the essential infrastructure through which opportunities and reputations and ideas and stories flow. And we also know that the data that flows through those networks is unevenly distributed. And the consequence of that is that the decisions that are taken about which storytellers and which stories are worthy investments are unevenly distributed. And it's also important that we need to understand the networks that form the infrastructure of the industry as spaces where power and influence are circulated. So it struck my research partner and I, Professor Deb Verhoeven, who is the Canada 150 Chair in Cultural Informatics at the University of Alberta, that we needed to interrogate the content of the networks through which data flows in the film and TV industry about whose stories and which storytellers are deemed worthy investments. And Sharon, what was really interesting was that in order to understand the content of those networks, we needed data in its own right. And the data that we sought in order to examine the networks is by and large publicly available data. We were looking for production lists in order to examine to conduct a social network analysis of the key players within the Canadian film and TV industry. And what became very evident early on is that data itself was highly politicized, and it was extremely difficult to coordinate the collection of data in an industry that is both publicly subsidized and in which lots of this data should be publicly available. So it's underscored to us that we need to begin to interrogate the problem of how or if we collect data, who the data is for, how we begin to share data so that we can understand the content of those networks. That data itself shouldn't be a barrier. But key to the report is that we interrogated the question of risk. How does the industry understand risk in an unprecedented operating environment through which risk is at the forefront of everybody's minds at the moment? And one of the first things we encountered is that the sharing of data itself is perceived as risky. So that strikes us that we really urgently need a national conversation about what data is, who holds data, how do we share data. And the panel today, I think, is going to be able to really speak to the richness of what data means, because it goes well beyond head counting into if we want to promote rich and meaningful transformation towards equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. And then I'd like to call in Tamara DeWitt from the Canada Media Fund, if you have anything to add to that question or to bring forward.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sharon, for including me today. I think if you look at the CMF and you look at the work we've been doing, and I say it's also work we're starting in terms of equity and inclusion, our strategy, like if you think of our strategy as a house, data is the foundation. It is, to me, the most important part of this house and of rethinking structures in our sector and rethinking structures of the CMF. But within that, I also want to say, there's different types of data that we talk about. There's different types of research that the CMF funds. We look at trends. We look at things that are happening in terms of audience, in terms of consumption, in terms of export. But the real sort of core, I guess, central pillar of our equity and inclusion house is the demographic data of who is in the house and who is not in the house. So that's a lot of the work that has been really key to start. We were able to collect some personal demographic information through our COVID relief programs, and that was, I think, really helpful to start to understand who was in and who wasn't, and then to look even deeper into information within that to understand not just which racial and ethnocultural communities we're in, but what is the gender split? What is the intersectionality? What are the sexuality of those applicants? What regions are they from? What age are they? So there's many, many layers to this. I think, in terms of best practices, I don't think we have any yet at the CMF. I think we're learning and we're piloting. So, we've learned a lot from COVID. We learned a lot from the research we did in relation to the people who received some of our COVID relief money, especially money that went to people of color and Black communities here within Canada. Then now the second step is we've been building out a system for applicants to the CMF and persons in those applications to self-identify so that we can collect more demographic information. So if you look back to the COVID money, that was very much tied to shareholders because we didn't want people to self-identify on behalf of other members of their crew, members of their team. So we really want to look at company structures and who owns the companies, because those are the sort of top line relationships that the CMF has in terms of who we fund are those companies. Now, as we start to continue this piloting, we can bring in more levels to the depth of that data. So that means top of line crew, and as we go forward below the line. And I think that's sort of the basis that we can grow out from. So applicants in the fall will start to see the option with the CMF, especially through our PPRC program, which is our pilot program for racialized communities, to join a system called Persona ID. And this is the system where you as an individual will give us this information so that we can start to understand who's in, who's not in. So sort of like what you said, Amanda, we can start to report and share information within the industry. And so that we can also understand who may be eligible to a program that is perhaps available only to certain communities. So I think that's sort of where we're at right now. It's the beginning. Our intention is to next year have a full functional self-identification system. But right now we're really in the pilot phase, in the learning phase. And that's why I'm really happy to be here on this panel and understand what other stakeholders are doing within this space and how we can share and learn.
Thank you very much. It ties in very well with what Amanda was saying too. I'd like to go to Sarah Diamond now. Dr. Diamond.
Great. Thank you so much, and I'm honored to be on this panel. And I'm currently on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Wendake-Neon Wensatio, the Mississauga, Anishinaabe, and Beausoleil First Nations. I thank them for their continued stewardship of these lands. So I'm speaking today from the perspective of someone who's now a researcher in visualization and data analytics, but also long-term institutional leader. And I guess, in this for the long game, at OCAD University and before that at the Banff Centre, going way back to women in the director's chair and, very strongly over decades advocating gender equity and being an ally around issues of BIPOC inclusion and representation. And I think we have new tools. And data analytics and collection represent those tools. So I think we're in a moment where it's really critical that the tools are seized, in a sense, by those who need to take power and take the power of analysis. So some of the projects that I'm involved with, I recently collaborated with Synapse from Montreal, and Quebec has been involved in a really important process of collecting audience data across the province of Montreal, and worked with them in the audience agency to create an event which a number of you were part of, called Data Echo Culture. And it really was looking at data fluency across Canadian and international cultural organizations. And it was examining audience development with a very strong focus on inclusion. So looking at everything from ways to design surveys, understanding the use of and the building of diverse panels. Panels are the group of people that you collect data from, understanding how to work with communities who do not want to provide their data, to government and other kinds of authorities that have historically oppressed them, and really looking at how to integrate different kinds of data sources and how to engage and connect creators, organizations, and audiences. And that organization, Data Echo Culture, is going to continue to do our work, particularly looking at how to build data fluency. I've done some work with Heritage Canada in developing visualization tools to, again, popularize and make available the general social survey data, which looks at Canadians' consumption of culture and practices in culture in relationship to different kinds of difference and diversity within Canadian audiences. And I'm currently starting a project which I think is very relevant to this conversation with Magnify Digital, which is a company out of Vancouver, to expand their tools, their viewer-centric tools, to develop a scoring system for the qualitative analysis of screen media products to integrate into their system. And it will look at audience impact analysis tools and also have accompanying visualizations. And the idea here is to build qualitative analysis tools, so qualitative tools that can go hand in hand with quantitative tools in order to look at the self-evaluation and the reception of different kinds of projects, looking at, for example, health and wellness impacts, and also looking at audience segmentation. But again, very much within the lens of looking at cultural diversity, looking at Indigenous producers and audiences. We will be working closely with Joan, I hope, and with Jesse at the Aboriginal Film Office. and Indigenous Film Office. And part of what we're doing is building survey tools, as I mentioned. We're also looking at ways to develop a system that will combat inherent bias and ensure cultural equity and promote fair competition at festivals by looking at scoring, ranking, and critical reception data. We're looking at gaps in the current categories and ways that there's current hierarchy-driven approaches to ensuring fairness. And we're also looking at ways of adapting ranking systems to promote producer-driven goals and context and really facilitate benchmarking. And part of the work that we're doing is to build using machine learning tools to look at how to use data scraping in appropriate ways from social media data, again, to really look at, how can we think about intended audiences and how do we bring together those audiences and producers who really represent the kind of diversity, the exciting diversity of screen media in this country. So that's some of the work I'm currently involved with, and I'm also very interested in policy initiatives that, we can engage with to ensure that there's appropriate, respectful data collection and access to that data. And we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Joan, I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm really happy to be a part of this discussion. I first wanted to say that my point of reference to this conversation is not pre or post pandemic. I see it as pre and post George Floyd and the biggest civil rights movement in my lifetime, and I see that there's been slow movement towards equity inclusion in the industry. I think before for gender equity, I think there's only been lip service to Black people working within the screen industries as well as Indigenous and people of color. And certainly anti-Black racism had not been moving. Now many people are listening and scrambling to make changes. But as everyone's been saying, there's no data to work with or very little. So at the Black Screen Office, we're initiating our own studies to gather data to, we hope, provide tools for the industry to use to move from paralysis and plans to action. And one of the studies that we're in the middle of doing is called Being Seen. We've had 350 individuals participate in focus groups to talk about their experiences of lack of representation and to provide input into drafting directives for the industry to create authentic and inclusive content for underrepresented groups. And we've also launched a national race-based audience survey. There's been very shallow data on audience demographics, such as racial groups, immigration status, language, and other characteristics. And there's been no data on media preferences of underrepresented communities, what they watch, how they watch it, how much they watch, where they watch it. And also there's little understanding of the attitudes and preferences of these audiences, regarding their desire to see greater, qualitative and quantitative representation on screen, both mainstream stories and race-based content. And finally, as an organization, we think it's really important to know who the Black Canadians are who are working within the industry. And so we're doing a market survey to find out who they are, where they are, what their experiences have been in the industry, their successes and failures, their access to professional development training. And this data is not only useful to us as an organization, but we think to the entire industry, because everyone's making commitments to being inclusive, but we need to know who we actually want to include. So I never thought I would be a person who would be so much into data, but starting this new organization and realizing that literally we had nothing to work with, and we knew of our own personal experiences, but we felt that it was crucially important to gather the data so that we can not only make the argument but begin to make change.
So true, so true. Thank you very much, Joan. And now, Doreen. would you like to speak to the question?
Hi, I'd like to address the why was part of that question. The why I'm doing this sort of work is because it obviously needs to be done. Indigenous people, and I count myself in this, I'm Sukwopnik and Tanaha, and I'm a survivor of the Indian residential school. And today when I say I'm a survivor, it means much more than I survived the torture, the horrendous torture and abuse that they inflicted on me in that school. But I also survived being murdered. When you think about the children that are being dug up today, that are being discovered at all of those supposed schools, I could have been one of those children. So this is why I'm doing this sort of work, is to fight for our inclusion. We are the people, the first peoples of these territories, and yet we have got this horrendous history with Canada. We've been colonized, we've been genocide has been inflicted on us, and we have been excluded from the film industry. So today is the time that we have to fight for our inclusion. And part of that process is decolonization and understanding the history of these territories. And I've heard mentioned twice in the previous speakers the acronym BIPOC. One of the decolonization tools that I ask people to use is to stop and think when they hear a term, and to correct it if they feel that it's incorrect. It should be IBPOC, Indigenous. These are our territories. These are the lands that our ancestors have fought and died on. And to start putting Indigenous people first in our hearts is the beginning of accepting and understanding the horrendous wrongs that have been done to the first peoples of these territories. I've been doing a number of different things, lobbying for different inclusion and developing different types of programming. I sit on a number of boards and panels. I work tirelessly to get our voice into the different organizations. So I'm part of the Motion Picture Industry Production Association Equity and Inclusion Committee, and through that group I've called for a revamping of the motion picture industry orientation training program to include equity and inclusion training, and I've further called for a micro kind of orientation program for existing people who would currently work in the industry, because it's not good enough to retrain just the people entering. We also need to retrain the people who are already in the industry. I've also been working with some of the larger production companies, trying to build out more mentorship training programs for Indigenous, Black, and people of color, where the hours that they work in those internships qualify them for permittee hours. And we have run a pilot with Disney, and it was somewhat successful. So we're hoping to continue to work with the bigger companies to bring more Indigenous, Black, and people of color onto those larger productions and help them get into the unions. I found an enormous resistance from the unions. I find them to be the greatest block as far as getting our people into positions. I've requested support in developing a new position, the Equity and Inclusion Coordinator position, because I think if we develop a position like that who is focused on equity and inclusion, rather than a whole bunch of us working off the corners of our desk, if we actually develop a department dedicated to that sort of work, that we will move forward a lot faster, and we will be able to actually access the difficult to access stats like Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I've also worked with the Women in Film lobby team. We've been lobbying for a tax credit for Indigenous, Black, and people, well, particularly Indigenous people. But I've also been in talks with the Indigenous Screen Office with Jesse Wente, and their interest is also in changing the process for tax credits so that Indigenous people don't have to wait for those returns. They get them sooner. And that would help to support the Indigenous independent productions, particularly, but Indigenous productions. I've also developed a new business affairs training program because there's a lack of Indigenous producers. So I developed it, I fundraised for it, and we've been offering that training to mid-career producers. I've also formed and founded and have been delivering a very successful screenwriting program with women in film called Tricksters and Writers. So with those kind of initiatives, I'm building capacity. For the last 13 years, I have been working and developing and running, managing, and offering an Indigenous film studies program, which is the only one of its kind in all of Canada. It's called the Indigenous Digital Filmmaking Program at Capilano University. There again, we've been building capacity. I was one of the founding members to develop and create the Indigenous Digital Accelerator with Capilano University, and it is a program that offers funding to Indigenous digital businesses to build out their digital platform and thereby grow their businesses. I met with Creative BC because they produced a statistical document called Below the Line Labor Market Study. I met with Creative BC and their statistical analysis experts to find out how they collected the Indigenous stats that were represented in that document, and found that their system was flawed. I pointed that out to them. They accepted that, that finding. So the ISO, the Indigenous Screen Office, and I made a request to them to either put a disclaimer on the internet or to pull the entire report down. They did neither. So with that kind of effort, though, it's practicing ongoing diligence, to review those kind of things, to call them out when they're inaccurate, to let people know that they're inaccurate, because in that report it says that they are meeting the needs of Indigenous employment in the industry, and they aren't, so it puts out false information. I also encourage our people to position themselves on boards and in positions of management and supervision of organizations so that we can speak for our people. But we don't have enough people that have the training, experience, ability to be in those positions. So that's been a really hard struggle. So I've been doing a lot of that, putting myself out there to be representative. There hasn't been an effort to capture Indigenous statistics, and there needs to be. So I'm really grateful for all of the people that are working on, on that front, that are on this team, and the many others that are out there. So those are the things that I'm doing myself, and those are the reasons why I'm doing it. And thank you very much for including my voice on this panel.
Thank you for sharing your work, Doreen, and your perspective on the lack of data. It's very helpful. So we'll move on now to the next question, and I'll mix up the order a little bit here. But the next question it's a visionary one. We have a visionary group of people here, of leaders and experts, and so I would love to know what your ideas are of how we can build a national data strategy, or should we have an agency in charge of collecting useful data in our industry? Who do you think needs to be at the table, and do you have any ideas how we could work together with other organizations to make that happen? And I know Joan had something she wanted to start off with, so I would love to hear from you.
I think we're at a place where we're not ready to even really talk about a national data strategy. I think it's become evident, at least for me, as we're doing the research that we're doing, and other people in this space who are doing this research, is that we have to disrupt the inherent systemic bias in the research methodologies to begin with. The current studies that only capture, most of them capture general population data with no regard for underrepresented groups. And so what we're doing to address this, even just at the very, very beginning stages of this work, is to document our own experiences of doing research, and and other groups who are doing this kind of research. Because as we're working with the larger research firms that are the ones who, we have to use in order to get funding. We're at every turn having to challenge the assumptions that are built into the methodologies that are being used. So we want to come together with other organizations who are doing this research to create a best practices guide to address the systemic issues in the approach to research. And we know, of course, that this guide would not be static, that, society is changing all the time and we learn more as we go along. But I think we need a place to start. And it can be the kind of guide that funding agencies that commission dozens of research studies each year that can use as to really examine what it is that they're looking for and what lens they're using to capture information. And it's something I think would be great for funders to make a must read for the consultants who they commission to do these studies. Because I think, again, just as a national strategy, there's a lot of re-education that needs to be done to equip us to do the work. And I think now there's no depth of understanding of what it means to do research with equity and inclusion as the foundation of the work. I think there's certainly some desire in some areas, like the CMF, for example, it's been evident there. But how do you do it? Like, how do you build it into your perspective and your lens in doing that work? So I think equity-seeking organizations really have to be involved and at the table in doing this work. I think they have to be seen as people who are the experts in this area. They need to be paid for their advice, input, and consultation. We can't expect to continue to do this work because it is vital work and it's important for the entire industry, not in our own self-interest. So we started our work in this research area, looking for people who or companies who had a focus on diversity or had teams that they worked with that included Indigenous, Black, and people of color, and we couldn't find anyone. And that's a problem that needs to be addressed. And I don't think it's that there are no qualified researchers out there who are part of our diverse communities. It's that they're not working in these larger agencies. And so I think, just to put a cap on it, just to say, yes, we need to do more research, and yes, it needs to be national and focused and inclusive, but we can't use the old methods, and there's just a lot of work to be done before we even know how to challenge what those methods are.
Thank you, Joan. That's so true. So, Tamara.
Sure. Thank you, Sharon. I think I'm going to answer this question, wearing a few separate hats. Yes, I work for the CMF. I really related, Doreen, to what you said about needing more of our people within the system, because I work for the CMF part-time. I still do other things as a producer, but I felt it was important to try and, go in the system and work internally to push for the change. So sometimes I see myself on, two sides of the street in terms of some of these conversations. And although I agree with everything Joan has said, I understood the question differently. So my answer is going to be a little bit different because of that. And maybe that's more because I was reflecting back to this report and thinking about demographic data and how do we come together nationally to collect that. I think this is always, terminology. When we say data, what do we mean? Because research and data is a huge thing. And I'm now going to talk about only one sort of smaller portion of that. So yes, wearing my hat as a producer, I would want one database, one system, one tool, because I don't want to have to say I'm a straight Black woman who's also East African and I'm in my 40s to every union, every funder, every broadcaster, and whoever else it is. So yes, as a producer, I would like that. I think there will be challenges in making that happen. I don't know, to be honest, that will ever happen. But, as a producer, that to me would be ideal. I think, from the position of the CMF, as I mentioned, we are launching this persona ID system, but we're also really interested in convening and bringing people together. So if there is an interest from equity and sovereignty seeking communities to come together around the table and talk about new ways, best practices, ideas. I know there's a large system in Australia that's attempting to collect all of this data into one sort of pot. Let's look at those things. And that's sort of something that the CMF can help with. We can convene. If this has a cost, then WIFT or other community organizations could apply to us. We will have a funding call opening in September. So right now during TIFF for equity and sovereignty seeking organizations specifically through an open call to come in with things like this. We are really interested in collaborative projects. So I don't know if this is a project that someone will want to do, be it now or at some point in the future, but I think, there's an interest in using us to help convene the different arms and legs of the industry. I will also say, wearing one of my other hats, many people know I'm a board member of the Racial Equity Media Collective, and the REMC has a report coming out this fall, which I think has a lot of the same, similar but different recommendations, really looking at policy and looking at how can all the actors in the industry work together in the best practices in terms of the collection of race-based data. But that's only that set of data for Indigenous, Black, and people of color. What about all of these other demographic pools that we want to have? And I think when we talk about consulting, learning, and best practices, we also have to consider looking outside the screen sector. What's happening in health, what's happening in education, what's happening with all of these other sort of sectors of our society here in Canada and internationally, and what can we learn, and how can we move forward in a way that hopefully helps us to be more equitable, but also helps us to maybe make the system a little bit easier in terms of people like me who are telling everyone right now about all these different things about myself, so I can hopefully tell a few people.
Thank you very much, Tamara. That's a very exciting development, and you'll be hearing from all of us, I'm sure, for support on this continuing work. Sarah, you wanted to go next on this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the contributions so far have been, really excellent about the need to think critically about data collection methods and analytics methods, and to look at, ways of bringing together the different sort of segregated initiatives that are taking place. So I guess one of the concerns I have is that the Canada Council for the Arts invested a huge amount of money in data collection efforts across many different cultural institutions, including IPAC organizations, including large organizations. A lot of data was collected, and then that data just sits there. And there hasn't been, because there wasn't a coordinated strategy going into that investment to take those initiatives and look at appropriate data sharing and aggregation tools, and to look at how to use existing tools, to screen data for bias, and to look at analytics tools that were being used for bias. Then you have these pools of data that essentially need, I think, and I'm talking about the larger cultural sector, less screen-based industries, that are kind of begging to be brought together and analyzed. So, I've been struggling with, what are the mechanisms to do that? And, wondering whether we have Statistics Canada as a very important part of taxpayers' dollars investment, billions of dollars to create, a federal agency. And Stats Canada has been increasingly also looking at issues of bias within data collection. They've been doing some important new surveys, LGBTQ plus work that is quite important. They're working very much with disability communities. to look at both data collection methods and representation methods and analysis methods that are inclusive of those different voices. So I think the agency that we should be looking to as we think about aggregating data, putting it through a GPA plus lens, which is really looking at gender bias and looking at intersectionality, is Stats Canada. I'm struggling with this, but in looking at what exists, I'm always leery to start something new when there's agencies that can be potentially transformed, including who works there, what their leadership is, what their methodologies are. So I think they're a really important partner moving forward in these efforts. And then my questions are too, and I mean, you started, with this, and Tamara, you also spoke to this, like what data, which data, what data are we talking about? And part of, if you've heard a little bit about my research, I'm very interested in audience analytics and how we can appropriately collect data about audiences, diverse audiences, what their needs are, what their interests are, and be able to support audience development and audience support, understand the impact of what's being produced on different kinds of audiences. And there was some amazing, material, Amanda, in the report in terms of looking at, the idea that if you make a project, if you create something for men that's sexist and violent, etc., women are basically going to be forced to watch it, and they'll be part of the audience because they're watching with their guy, right? So I just think that audience data, is the other face of the producer data. And obviously I'm working with a company that's working with producer data. And I'd love to look at ways that we can look at Beth methodologies to collect this, how to aggregate it, and how to work with an agency like Stats Can to continue to transform it so it works for us, right? Because we're part of that larger community. And I just noticed that the INFC which is Infrastructure Canada, has issued a call for proposals to strengthen community level data and research. And I think it's very interesting to think about cultural infrastructure as infrastructure. And I'd love to, maybe start a conversation about that call for funding, because it's significant dollars. And it could help to support, Tamara, some of the work that you're doing, and that, the Canada Media Fund is going to support through its investment.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's a really interesting point about Statistics Canada, because I've been interviewed by them a number of times. I've been lucky enough to get the census, the extended census, and yeah, they do have a large infrastructure for doing this kind of work, and it would be nice to involve them as a partner for sure. So I wanted to go to Amanda next.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, everybody. Wow, I get to swing in near the end here, and I'd like to support and echo everything that's been said already, and maybe draw together a couple of the key points. Joan, I've got big circles around some notes in my book. And thank you for raising the question of who do we partner with in the act of data collection? Data is social, data is relational, and the act of data collection is a political act, right? So one of the things that I would like to advance, perhaps as a self-serving member of the academic community, is that we would like to see a deeper, longer partnered relationship, because lots of the data, lots of the research methodology, innovation work, and deep thinking around data ethics and research ethics happens in the academic level. And I don't think that those relationships have been effectively cultivated to be able to think about this, to be able to enact this for all of the capacity that we may be able to build. And the other point that I'd really like to underscore, Joan, is that you're right, part of the research infrastructure, both consultancies and academics, are also part of the problem. So there's a lot of work that we have to do on our own end about how we ensure that the strategy for data collection and the communication of results happens in a meaningful way, in deep partnership with the communities about and with whom the data is designed to intervene. as a matter of social justice, equity, and inclusion. I think that we need to interrogate the diversity of data itself. Tamara, you raised part of it, like, yes, we're talking about demographic data. And what does that tell us about workforce diversity and inclusion? Doreen, you spoke incredibly eloquently about the methodology programs and the reporting and the consequence of what that looks like if it's not done well. Sarah, one of the really key things we found in interviewing key decision makers and key players is that audience data, or what people think they know about audiences, is profoundly shapes decisions about investment. And so that lack of really high quality data has a long lasting impact on investment decisions both here and on the other side of the border, which of course shapes the social world in which we live and how we see ourselves on screen, or if we see ourselves on screen. So I think I wasn't, in reading back to the question, Sharon, when we're talking about a national data strategy, I don't necessarily think we need to create a new agency. I'm not sure another layer of bureaucracy is what is required. I do think we need some kind of forum so that we can figure out who's doing what. There is so much activity happening right now in the sector. And if we don't begin to develop a framework through which we can talk with each other and about each other's work and leverage the work that's happening and challenge each other's methodologies and inform each other's strategies about what's happening, then we're going to risk a few things. We're going to risk duplicating work that may not need to be duplicated. We are going to miss an opportunity to learn from each other, which would be an enormous waste of an opportunity for a political and incredibly important social moment that is receiving a lot of attention right now. So we would risk duplicating work, we would miss learning from each other, and we then may not be able to capture the gaps or what needs to be done next. Right? So I don't think we need one national data collection strategy. I think we need a forum through which we can understand who's at the table, who's not at the table, who's doing the work, who should be doing the work, and so that we don't burn out really important communities who need to be at the center of this dialogue. I will say that it has been I was delighted to see that it is now expected that we pay research participants. That is a new development and not something that is normally best practice, or sorry, not common practice in the academy. So that small piece of information, right, has a really important effect in how we structure projects and really underscores best practice, particularly when we're working with communities that are marginalized and insecure, not to mention defined by precarious and insecure employment as a defining feature of the industry in the first instance. So yes, Tamara, I'm incredibly heartened to hear that there is an interest and an appetite for a national data task force, I would say, so that we can bring all the partners together. You know, Tamara and Doreen, you both spoke about, I don't want to have to say to every single union that asks me, right, about my demographic data. And Doreen, you spoke about the unions being part of the problem. We then need to have those discussions in a coordinated effort so that we can begin to tackle the problems, hopefully, and develop strategies through which we can work through them together.
Thank you, Amanda. That's a great summary, and you brought out many of the wonderful points people have been making. And we've got a few minutes left, and the final word goes to Doreen.
I'd like to point out that we also need to, again, think about the history of these territories. Indigenous people went through a period of forced enfranchisement where they lost their status as Indigenous people. Women who married non-Indigenous men lost their status as Indigenous people and it wasn't until Bill C-31 came in that they were able to start applying for and gaining their status back. So there's a lot of non-status Indigenous people that don't even know their history. There were a lot of children that went to residential school, and when they came out, had lost their status and haven't gained it back yet. There was massive numbers of children in the 60s scoop, and that 60s scoop actually continued on into the 70s and actually is still really going on today. The massive numbers of children that are in care today outnumber any other nation of children in care in Canada. And a lot of those kids are going through cultural shame and won't self-identify, won't identify as being Indigenous. And then we have the massive numbers of people like Joseph Boyden and Michelle Latimer who are wrongly claiming status as Indigenous people who aren't status. So when you start to try to collect that data, you have to be very aware of the history of Indigenous people. And then on top of all of that, you talked about Stats Canada. There's such a mistrust from Indigenous people. They don't even want to fill out those documents. And for a long time, they weren't filling them out. And then it became a law that they had to fill them out. And so it's still today, I have a friend, an Indigenous friend who worked for Stats Canada, and he suggested he hire all Indigenous people. Maybe if Indigenous people went on to reservations and into Indigenous communities, they would be more successful. They were only slightly more successful because then the Indigenous people didn't trust those Indigenous people coming in. So, there is a whole issue with collecting Indigenous data, but it does need to start with including Indigenous people, developing the strategies of how we will collect the data and what that data means. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. Well, I'll wrap it up now, but I'd like to say on behalf of the Women in Film and Television Canada Coalition, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, our experts, for sharing their knowledge and insights with us today. Your expertise is so inspiring, and I have a long list of things now that I'd love to be involved with all of you, so let's keep going. And I'd like to thank TIFF for giving us the opportunity to discuss what are, I think, incredibly important issues on their very large platform. So thank you.